Hello, welcome to Story Time. For Summer Read, Do, Explore, we're going to be telling stories, not reading stories. The story this week is from Portugal. It's called Stone Soup, and there's variations of stone soup found from countries all over the world. But this one has a character called Frei Mikael, and he's a traveler. Now, before I get into the story, let's start with our song. Hello friends, hello friends, hello friends, I'm glad to see you here. Now Frei Mikael was a friar, a monk, a brother. He lived in a monastery in one part of Portugal and was traveling to another part. As he traveled, he came upon the village of Almeirim. Almeirim had been having a hard time lately. There had been a lot of illness and sickness, and people were trying to stay away from each other. They didn't want strangers coming in. It had also been a hard time finding enough food, and they weren't feeling like they really could share too much of what they had. They felt like there wasn't going to be enough to go around. So when Frei Mikael came into town, people went in their houses, shut their windows, closed their doors, and pretended they didn't see him. Frei Mikael, on the other hand, he was a wise one. He pulled out a rock from his pocket, and he said out loud, because he knew people were actually listening behind the door and at their windows, he pulled out a rock and said, "This rock would make such a good pot of stone soup. If only I had a pot to begin to make the soup in." He heard a little scuffling behind the doors and the windows. He pulled out another rock, and he said, "And this one will be great seasoning. But how can I make stone soup without a pot?" A little girl who had been listening at the window of her parents' house came outside and said, "How big a pot do you need?" And Frei Mikael said, "Oh, an enormous pot." She said, "Well, my mom has a large pot." And he said, "How large?" She said, "Well, let me go get it." So she ran home and came back with an enormous pot. And Frei Mikael put in both of his stones. She said, "How is that going to be soup?" He said, "Well, we need some water to boil, and we need some wood to make a fire." So she went home and got her brother. They went and found some wood, and they put it under the pot and started to build a big fire with Frei Mikael's help. Some of the other kids in the village wondered what was going on, so they came out and said, "Well, we could get water." So they all went home and they came back with jugs of water and poured the water into the big, enormous pot. Pretty soon the water started to get warm, and Frei Mikael said, "This is a good start, but you know what would make this stone soup even better? A little salt and pepper." Well, by this point in time, the adults were coming out because they wondered what the kids were up to and who this stranger was. "Salt and pepper," said one woman. "I could bring that." So she ran home and came back with a salt and pepper shaker and put a little salt, put a little pepper in the enormous pot of what was now starting to get pretty warm water. Said Frei Mikael. "This is smelling better, but cilantro would make it even better." So another man said, "Well, I have cilantro growing at my house." He ran back and came back with some sprigs of cilantro and added it in. Smells pretty good. Other people were coming out and said, "It does smell pretty good." Garlic would be good," said one woman. So she ran home and got some cloves of garlic and brought them back and crushed them up and put them in the enormous pot. Other people were coming out and really enjoying the smell. Frei Mikael said, "Onions. Onions would be a good addition to this stone soup." And somebody said, well, I've got a couple of onions at home. And somebody else said, well, I know I've got at least one onion at home. And several people ran home and got onions. And they brought back their onions and they cut them up and they put them in the enormous pot of stone soup. So by now it had salt and pepper, cilantro, garlic, onions. Another man said, you know what I love in my soup? Carrots. I only have a few, but I could bring a carrot or two. And somebody else said, well, I know I've got carrots at my house. And pretty soon people from all over the village were coming in and cutting up their carrots and adding them into the enormous pot. Ooh, that soup was smelling even better. Parsnips, said one woman. I love parsnips in soup. What are parsnips? Asked one of the kids, who didn't remember ever seeing one. She said, well, they look like the carrots, except they're white. Let me go home. I've got parsnips from my garden. So she went home and got parsnips. And somebody else said, you know, I've got a turnip. So the turnip came, the parsnips came, they cut those up, and they put them into that pot, that enormous pot of stone soup. Fray Mikael said, cabbage. Oh, cabbage would be so good. And everybody in the village shrugged and said, we haven't seen cabbage in weeks in the market. And he said, I can do without it. Tomatoes. That's what somebody said they needed next. And pretty soon all the kids were going home and they were coming back with a tomato here and a tomato there. And somebody came back with a big basket of tomatoes. They cut up those tomatoes and they added them to that giant pot of stone soup. It was smelling so good. And then one woman said, you know, we grow the best beans in all of Portugal here in Almeirim. We even call our little beans pebbles because they look like little pebbles. I'll go home and bring some beans. It wouldn't be a soup from Almeirim if it didn't have little pebble beans in it. So she went back and came home with an enormous jar of soaked beans and put the beans in that enormous pot of stone soup. It smelled so good. An older man who hadn't been there yet came up and said, what's all the commotion? Why is everybody together? I haven't seen everybody this close together in months. And who's this stranger? This is Fray Mikael, said the girl who had first come out of her house, and he's showing us how to make stone soup. Stone soup, said the man. Ha! Never heard of such a thing. What's in there? And they told him all the things that were in there. Salt and pepper and cilantro and garlic and onions and carrots and parsnip. No cabbage, of course. Tomatoes and beans and turnip. And he said, well, you can't have a soup without potatoes. I'll go get some. And so he went home and came back with an armload of potatoes. So they cut up the potatoes and put them in that enormous pot of stone soup. Oh my gosh, it smelled so good. People ran home and got tables and chairs and plates and cups, and pretty soon a gigantic spread was laid out. And then a woman came on and said, well, if we've got all this laid out, I've got bread at home. I'll bring some good crusty bread to go with this stone soup. And another man came in and said, you know, I've got a lot of sausage at my house. I think I could add some of it to this soup. I don't need all of it. So he brought some sausage. And they put the sausage in the soup, and the potatoes and the beans and the tomatoes, no cabbage, parsnips and carrots and turnip and onions and garlic and cilantro and salt and pepper. And they had big loaves of crusty bread. And they all sat down, and Fray Mikael ladled out bowls of soup to the entire village who had joined them. And they said, oh, we've never had such a meal as this stone soup. Fray Mikael, thank you for sharing your stone soup recipe with us. And he said, thank you for creating a feast that we all could enjoy. And that is the story of stone soup. One version of it.